there's so much investment in healthcare right now.
What is charge capture?
They now have to understand. They have to be involved and they have to be engaged.
Hello and welcome to the RevTech Rx Podcast. I'm your host, David Kozlowski, and today we're talking about the biggest charge capture issues hospitals face. Alongside me is the CEO of Avelead, Javad Sheikh, Laura Fox, the Director of Revenue Cycle Services, and Greg Forshee, who is the VP of Client Success at Avelead. Well, everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. Coming into Nashville, how are your travels? Good?
Wonderful.
Great.
Right.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're in a cool place right here at the Sound Emporium in the heart of Nashville, which is pretty exciting. Did you guys ever think you'd be doing a podcast or a video with us in a sound studio?
Absolutely.
Yeah, looking at Laura.
Yeah, well, we're excited to talk about this really good topic related to biggest charge capture issues in hospitals. So to set the scene and kind of get things moving, why don't we just start at the basics? What exactly is the charge capture process in hospitals?
No, that's a great place to start because there's so much confusion around revenue cycle. It's such a big topic, and then you get into revenue integrity. From collecting charges, patient registration, and then just dropping the bill. There's so much stuff that's going on, and I think it's a great place to start. And then Lori probably can define exactly what part of that is charge capture. She's the expert, so I'm going to let her explain it.
So charge capture is the process of capturing the services rendered and documented by our providers. And it is a big challenge because our clinicians, they just want to take care of our patients. That's their focus. They don't want to worry about is this chargeable or not chargeable. So behind the scenes, we just have to make sure that there is someone that has an understanding of what is chargeable and not chargeable. It's a big thing today, especially with the crisis in healthcare right now. It just really needs to be noted and taken down, what is charge capture and who should be doing it.
Yeah, when you talk about it being a big thing, what are the repercussions of not doing charge capture appropriately? What does that look like?
Well, I think margins and the way the hospitals operate are so tight right now, right? It's the biggest thing is how are you capturing everything that's happening, and how is everything is actually generating revenue for the hospitals. So as you can kind of see, there's so much investment in healthcare right now, and there's so much money being lost because of missing charges and lack of charge capture. And the only thing, just to add on to Laura's definition, to me, charge capture really sits in the middle of that clinical and that financial world. And that's what makes it really key because everything's happening in the hospital. Some things are charged for, some things are not, and knowing what needs to be connected is where charge capture comes in. So it's really the heart in the middle of a healthcare clinical and financial system.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest issues then? Just like getting straight to the root cause, like what are the biggest issues that are currently happening in today's healthcare world when it comes to charge capture? Obviously.
I think a big thing is that it's just a lack of understanding that you have at these hospitals, right? Like Laura mentioned, a clinician, they want to be a clinician. They went to school to provide patient care. They don't necessarily care about charging, right? But it's bridging that gap between financial and clinical where they now have to understand it. They don't have a choice. We're going to clinically driven revenue cycle where their documentation is driving charges. And so they have to be involved and they have to be engaged, even though it's something that they probably didn't go to school to ever want to be a part of.
And they all want to know that what they're providing is helping with the financial health of the hospital. They're providing such good health care to the patient itself, but at the same time, they have to understand that that's the financial health of their organization also. That, everything that they provide has an outcome that is or is not chargeable, and they have to understand that.
And I think a big part of that, too, is I always tell them, do you want a budget? Do you want to buy new equipment? Do you want to hire more staff? Then you got to give about charging appropriately, right? Because if you don't, when you ask for this increased budget or you ask for more staff, if you're not generating revenue, it's going to go the opposite direction. They're going to want to remove staff and make you more lean and not buy that equipment that you've been asking for. So they have to care, even though they might not want to.
Right. And it doesn't have to be, not everyone has to care, but there has to be that team within each organization that understands what is happening in my organization, how is my system set up, how can I charge, how can I make this easier on my clinical staff to do their job every day and still have that financial outcome on the back end. And I think that's a big struggle now, too, is getting that team that understands within our organization to help us get to that point so that our clinicians don't have to let that be their main focus. They can see the patient, document on the patient, and finish that work.
It sounds like there's multiple questions that has come from that. So the first one is it sounds like there's a teamwork system being in play, right? Like there is no like, it's not a one department. It's actually a cohesive group of individuals that have to work on this. Is that an accurate statement?
Very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you talked about this one team though that has to work on this. It has to understand the system. It has to be able to understand how to train. What is that team?
That team is generally going to be made up of your financial team, your IT team, and your clinical team. There should be members from all of those teams within this group organization that can help put this together.
Do most hospitals have that already?
They have, I would think, some semblance of it, but I think that's where a lot of our struggle is getting the right people in the right place to help them do that work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it adds on to the I think the number one problem or challenge in charge capture is people communication or understanding it, right? Or being understand, hey, what I'm doing here on the clinical side has the impact on the financial side. And that one team helps, as long as they have clarity in their roles, hey, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what I'm supposed to do, that's will make it more effective. And that's how you can fix some of those challenges.
When you guys go to hospitals, are you typically seeing issues in charge capture in general? Like constant everywhere you go?
Yes, it is hard, very hard. So
Right out the gate. Greg, what about your experience? I know that you worked at a hospital directly too for a while. Like, what was that like?
Besides that, yeah, they're awful at it. But out of the 100 that I've been to, I haven't met one. Maybe you have, or you have, that has done it well, is good at charge capture. I think the main kind of scenario that I always see is what Javad mentioned. You have a person who really understands the clinical side of it. You have a person who really understands the financial side of it. Do you have a person that understands both? Yeah, more times than not, you don't, right? So it has to be this team approach, and you have to have people that understand each part and how they impact each other. And most times, at least the hospitals that I've been to, that doesn't exist.
In hearing that it's difficult, okay, so you're talking about a lot of people is what I'm hearing, okay, that makes it harder, or rather, they're not in sync, okay. What is there anything else outside of just this team or the people that make charge captures is genuinely difficult? Like, what? There's got to be more than just like education or people. Like, what does that look like?
I think it's the content of what they need to know or not know. I think it's a lot of it's when we talk about communication, even terminology. For example, we'll get into like managing a charge master. So you'll have a financial person that says that this thing is called a chest X-ray, and then a clinical person is looking for a TV. So just being able to communicate and understand clinical speak versus financial speak is a big deal. So we all get bills and in the mail, and you can't even understand what the bill says. That's the financial jargon, or somebody just wrote that this is this code. And so understanding the process, and then understanding the nomenclature or the content, and being on the same page, or to use the sports analogy, just everybody's not on the same playbook or using the same playbook. I think it's a key part of it as well.
One of the things that Laura mentioned in the very beginning was related to physicians and their documenting, right? Making sure that they're documenting correctly. How is this, we're in 2021, how is this difficult? Like, is this like a hard task? Like, what am I missing?
I think, at least from my perspective, one of the biggest issues that we see is that not every department charges the same. So you might say, yeah, this clinician or this doctor uses an order that drives a charge, and that's how you're capturing charges for that specific department. But in therapy or in radiology or surgery, they don't capture charges that way at all. They actually do it very differently in the system. So you have complexities within each department within the same hospital that you can't really standardize it to say everybody's capturing charges this same way, because they're not. Each department is actually capturing them very, very differently. And as they moved from paper, like it was back in the day, you could say we all have a paper checklist and it all looks the same, and we're all going to give it to Betty Lou and she's going to all key these charges in, and we're using the same exact charge capture process because we're all on paper. That's went away. And just the way they document and charge within their system now is so different within a hospital, within a department. And it just creates a lot of complexity that a lot of people don't understand how you capture charges in radiology versus therapy versus surgery.
Yep. And just to kind of add on to that, this is a recent example where, we're looking at surgery charges that are very expensive, and being able to know what the difference between a screw that costs 15 cents versus a screw that might cost $1,000, right? It's very significant. And it's, from a layman's point of view, it's easy, but you got to be very specific in what you're documenting, right? That I use this, or I use this material, which is very different from pharmacy charges, for example, which is, hey, I put in a pharmacy order, should I charge then? Or do I do a pharmacy charge when someone's actually dispensed the medication? Things like that.
So from the clinical perspective, what's the gripe? Like, where's the rubber meet the road in the sense of like, do they just not know? Is it a frustrating part? They like they care about patient experience, right, and patient care. So where are the problems accumulating? Is it because they're just not communicating? Is it a tool issue? Is the program really complicated to work in?
Could be that. Could be that they just don't know where the finalization of the documentation is and what is the last step I have to do to ensure that that charge drops. I think that's real important when they go onto a system that they understand A to Z. What do I have to do as a clinician? I'm not writing on paper like Greg was saying. I'm not documenting on a paper where I can see everything I've written down. I'm in a checklist on the computer, and I have to complete that documentation so that those charges can drop, if that's the way they're dropping charges. Again, it's the complexity of how many different ways can I capture charges even within a system. You're going to capture charges many, many different ways, and understanding what's my job, what's my piece of the pie when I'm in this system. So
Yeah. So let's say all this goes well, okay, and you've created this great process, and we'll go into the details as to what kind of that process looks like. But let's say it goes well and everything's done accordingly. Does it just only affect the bottom line for the hospital, or are there other areas that this affects? Does it affect patients? Does it affect is it just the dollar amount that gives the budget that we're associating to, or?
No, there's so many different things. Just even utilization, right? Is like, all right, what are our staffing needs? And so these metrics are used throughout an organization or a hospital organization as well.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll add too, besides think about being a patient, and I know I had a CAT scan done, and I know I had lab work done, and I know I had something else done, and you actually get your itemization or itemized bill of services provided, and half of them are missing, and you're like, oh, I'm fairly confident I got put underneath the machine, right? I know that I went through that experience, unless I was on really good drugs, and I'm just making stuff up. But your bill doesn't match that. Your itemized services provided don't match that. So you have I'm a real patient. This is my experience. I know I had this done, and I ask you to show me everything that I had done, and you can't show me, right? Or my bill doesn't match what services I think I had or didn't have. And so just from a patient experience standpoint, consumers are more engaged than they've ever been in their own healthcare, right? Because they don't really have a choice. It's coming out of their pocket a lot of times. You don't want to be the hospital that has the patient that said, yeah, you charged me for $1 million of items that I'm pretty sure I went in there for an appendectomy that was probably $10,000, right? So, there's that whole side of the coin too that I think hospitals have to understand and be aware of.
Yeah. So it sounds like not only does it affect a good charge capture process, affect just, your bottom dollar, the budgets for the departments, et cetera, but it also improves patient experience, which is a big deal. Is there any other entities that you can think of? An example, like does a CNO care about charge capture?
I think a CNO would care. A lot of times it's their staff. Most of the clinicians are a good portion of the clinicians probably report to a CNO in a hospital, and they do care. They are the first one to tell you, though, I don't care about charges. I care about patient care. But really, they mean that when they're with their staff. But then when they're with the finance team, then they do care because they do want to hire more nurses. So they do care. It's just hard. It's hard to cross that line between finance and clinic work.
And if it's not done correctly, though, wouldn't the medical record be incorrect? And that would obviously be a problem for the CNO.
That would definitely be a problem for everybody, not just the CNO.
Yeah, duplicate charges. We've seen, which is kind of scary to think about, but you have a lot of times you have a patient that will see all these different charges or services on them. Like, oh yeah, actually that's not the patient we saw at all.
Right.
Somebody selected the wrong MRN or the wrong encounter number, the totally wrong patient. And so as a CNO, you're like, how the hell did that happen? But it's because they don't understand all the steps from A to Z that they needed to take to be able to document correctly, capture charges correctly. Let's start with picking the wrong patient is probably step A, I think. But
yeah. So let's paint the perfect picture of what this really looks like. Are we using tools? Are we just having meetings? Are we, formulating a team and a group of people? What's the process look like to make it to where it actually works in a hospital? If you were to give advice to a hospital and step in day one, what are you telling them?
Yes, and yes. All of the above what you just said.
What does that look like? Yeah.
No, I think it starts with having good process and procedures in place and clear roles and responsibilities, right? I think if you kind of lay that out, and then it kind of gets into content, right? Making sure the charge masters are accurate, they're maintained accurately. We were just talking about professional fees versus technical fees this morning. So even the administration, so they understand it as well too, because half the time they don't understand the impact of what they're doing clinically has on the financial side.
Agreed with that. It's not an easy process to set up, and it's ever changing. That's the other thing. Medicare is ever changing on us. Every quarter we get an update from Medicare of something we can do now or we can't do, and so we have to stay on top of that. It's not always just that one list. Here's what you can do, because it's going to change. So you have to always keep up with it and make sure that you've built out your system correctly, and you're always educating on anything new that you're doing or not going to be able to do in the future from a charge capture perspective. So
we didn't even mention compliance and regulatory requirements as one of the challenges as well too.
That is a big challenge.
That's a big one.
That is a big
When
challenge.
you were managing the large health system, how frequent did you guys update that or
Oh
review
my
it?
goodness. Charge masters for us grew daily when we were managing. I guess when I was managing the healthcare system, it depends on what hospitals are rendering what services. You have to stay on top of it. It's a big thing, and it's hard to manage. It is hard to manage, and the education that goes into it is just a huge part of it, and the communication, and making sure that the outcome of that education and communication is what happens. A lot of times, it's repetitive that we have to go over and over and over it. So.
Yeah, and something as you were kind of talking through that I didn't even think about till just now was even just like you're updating all these policies, you're updating it as Medicare has these updates. But what we've seen a lot recently is there's been a lot of turnover at hospitals. So yeah, you go through this education and you go through all this documentation and you're perfect, right? Like you have did everything that you were supposed to do. But how do you account for we have a new ED director or a new surgery director that they didn't give that information to, and they don't have no idea what they're doing. They don't know how to capture charges. They don't know how to reconcile. They know nothing about the process because no one passed on that information. And how would you know that they had a new director that started last week?
Or they're
right?
doing it differently wherever they came
Yep,
from.
that's
That's
what I
right,
was going to
that's right.
say. Oh, I was on this system when I was at that hospital. Now I'm on this one. How do I put those two in line? How do I get all my knowledge in line with my new system? It's communication. We have to keep those lines open and just constantly talk about that financial health of the hospital, because that's where we're going to get the win-win, is keeping that financial health as healthy as the patients that we're trying to discharge. So.
It sounds like the recurring theme is just, and same with any company, right? Is just effective communication and making sure that there is a potential team that is helping distribute that communication.
Yeah.
So are most hospitals, when you guys enter them, are they aware of this problem? Or are they oblivious to it? Do they know that this is happening, in their own house, if you will? Or is it just like complete shock? And then what do the results look like? Like, what does that end up being? If we helped you build an effective charge capture process, this is what happened. This is why you need to do it.
I think that they are not totally oblivious. I think a lot of times they know they have issues, and that's why they pull in companies like ours. And I think what they're shocked about is to the extent that they have it, because they hire people who they feel like have the knowledge that they need to work their departments, and then you get a third party in there that helps along. What about this? What about this? What about this? And they're like, oh wow, we haven't thought of that. Yes, that is chargeable, or no, that's not chargeable. And to go through all those steps and then come out with a good process and a good set of charges. So I think it's a big thing.
Yeah. Greg, you're a numbers guy. What would you say in the experience of your life, when a good charge capture process to a bad one, how much we losing?
Oh God, you want the nice number or the mean number or somewhere in the middle? I would say on average, it's about 10% of their overall clinical volume. So if I had 100 orders within a lab department, about 10 of those would be like a miss of some sort in their charge capture process. When you start to talk about how that ties in with revenue, if you're talking about 10% of a person's gross revenue, and we're talking millions and millions of dollars, and that's just at scale, right? That's even for a baby hospital that's 25 beds. And then it just gets incrementally worse as you have a 500-bed hospital. We're talking $1 million on the low end, all the way up to $50 million on the large end of that. So
yeah,
it's a big impact for them.
Yeah, I know HFMA has a number about like 1% of revenue, but what we've seen in our clients and our data, it's revenue wise, not the clinical, is it's been around 2 or 3% at least,
That's right. Yeah,
and that's
totally
kind of
agree.
on the low end. So it's what we're finding.
And think about your net revenue. If you're
Yeah.
a $10 million hospital, right? Well, 1 to 3% is a lot. And we're talking monthly. We're not talking about
Mhm.
over the course of the year.
And we're
Right.
talking about gross revenue before we ever hit bottom line. We're talking about getting that gross
Mhm.
revenue up to par where it needs to be on a daily basis, so that monthly number that does come out is correct.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm going to go a little off script of what kind of we wrote down, but on top of we're finding this missing revenue. That's great. But I also have heard, and through the grapevine, that not all the times is this an easy process, right? You're talking about flipping over a hospital upside down, reinstituting new processes, creating a team, new workflows. How much more work does this make for that 2%? Is it a lot more work? Is it become easier? Does it eventually become like advantageous for hospitals to convert to this? Well, everyone's smirking. And I'm not trying to not trying to downplay, but I'm just curious, like, what does that effort look like?
It's a big effort, and but it needs to be done. That's the thing, and everybody recognizes that it needs to be done. There's not a hospital out there that doesn't know they need this. But again, being able to budget that time for those people and budget that money for what's needed, and possibly software that's needed to get this done. It's a big ask of a hospital to put this together. But do I think on the back end that it's going to pay off? Absolutely, and it's going to pay off in a short amount of time. It's not a 5-year investment. It is a year investment usually, I would say, because when you're looking to add at a high end 10% to your bottom line, you can get that sometimes within one department if you revamp their charge master and look at their process and make sure that step A to step Z is completed appropriately. And then once you get that department done, you move to the other departments. You put that process in place and you make it work. So,
When hospitals work with you, Laura, do they feel very calming when you enter the room and they're like, "Thank goodness you're here to help us through this whole entire process"?
No.
Handhold me.
no, never. Because they know you're here to point out something I can't do right. And so it's always a negative start with such a good positive outcome. But you always have your negative Nellies who don't want to participate, and they're the ones you usually need the most information out of. The people that don't see the process and understand that there is an outcome to this that is such a positive outcome. So, yeah, but it happens. The positive part comes pretty quickly, I think.
The only thing I would add to that, because I think it's a general issue where are we creating more work, or are we? It depends on where they are, right? If they've been doing something manually and we can automate it, that makes their life easier. And in most cases, or if they're not doing it all, then we're adding a little bit over. But the issue is really not the actual work itself. I think it's a general issue with everybody. It's change. I'm just used to doing it this way. Even if my life is going to be much easier by doing this new technology or this new system that it will automate a lot of stuff I'm doing manually, I just don't like change, and people just don't like change. So that's the hard part. It's just getting them to change. Once they've accepted it and it's actually working and they see the results, then it's much easier for them. It's less work for them, actually, for a greater bang for their buck.
And it's kind of crazy when you start to talk about like folks who aren't involved in the process. You say, no, I actually met a department director today that prefers to have this stack of 50 papers as opposed to something that's automated and it is on a screen and it's just going to show them like 3 things to look at. But it's all about that change, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're so in love with these papers that they've been using for 10 years. That's the way we've always done it, that they don't want to change this, even if it's going to save them 2 hours a day, right?
There's a lot of security in that paper. It's hard not to have that tangible thing in your hand that says what I did today.
Yeah.
I can prove to you I did this. Where on the computer, I have to think, how can I prove this? That bottom line is going to prove it for you. Just relax, and let it flow.
That speaks to what we were just talking about before we started with the meaningful use, EMR, medical records. That was a huge change for the healthcare industry. Healthcare's got a lot to do to get technology advanced or to modernize. I think we're there, or very close to there, at least on the clinical side, but now we're trying to push that on the financial and the revenue cycle side. So a lot to go.
Yeah, you said one thing, and I want to touch on it. You said automation. It's a buzzword right now in the industry, right? Everyone's automating. There's artificial intelligence. What automation is it that people can utilize in the in the charge capture process?
there's kind of so many things. What we try to, at least from a product or solution perspective, I always look at, hey, what's the job to be done, right? What are we doing? We were just talking about, if I'm a clinician or I'm a department director, I've got to go into my system, pull my reports of all my clinical activity that maybe happened the previous day. Then I go look at all the bills that are generated, and I've got these reports and I'm matching them up. So I look at what needs to be automated, not as, hey, what's good automation, but what's the job to be done? How do I help the end user do their job more efficiently using technology or using automation? So we kind of focus on those type of things to say, hey, if I'm doing this manually to reconcile, can I use technology or automation to do that for me and then just spit out the gaps? So I'm only looking at those 3 things rather than those 50 pieces of paper.
And the word on the street is that if you find things that are manual processed, that typically somebody will just tell you guys and you'll make it, right? You're like, oh, we can automate that. We'll fix it. Yeah. No, that's great.
You want it right or wrong?
Yeah. Cool. So I guess I want one last question. Where do we think the future's going? You say monthly things are changing, right? We talk about healthcare is this ever changing, ever evolving. But then we also talk about, while it's ever changing and evolving, it's ancient, right? It's all of a sudden like, it doesn't make any sense how something can continue to grow every single month, but at the same time still be left behind in the dust and so many other things. Where are we going to be in the next 2, 5, 10 years? Where do you think we'll be, rather?
I think there's 2 parts to that. One is we've got to use things like automation or technology to make lives easier for the providers, right? And we got tools to do that, and getting them to transition and change to be able to accept it and then adopt it and utilize it. So that's the first part. I think getting these systems in place, getting them educated, and then making sure they're using it. The second is what's always changing is there's always going to be changes. There's always going to be a maintenance component to it. There's always going to be a keeping it updated, right? The compliance or regulatory, those things, like we went from ICD-9 to ICD-10. There's going to be always something. So it's having a good base foundation of technology, but then a good way to manage and maintain that, right? Like managing the charge master, managing your daily revenue reconciliation. How do you do that? Make updates to that. If you have a new department that comes up or new service line that started, how do you build that and make sure whatever's being built and that charge capture process is updated accordingly? So it's twofold: getting it built and then continually maintaining that system on an ongoing basis as well.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. That managing those changes that's just one of the biggest hurdles that we face in healthcare right now is that total management of step A to step Z. So.
Yeah. And the only thing I'll piggyback off of both of them that I would add is, once we have a good standard and we're able to manage change and do all these different things well, to me, you get to the point where you start to actually do some valuable things, right? Let's start to say, now that we have all this data and we understand our charge capture process and we feel really good about it and we're doing a good job with all our processes, then now let's use that data and start to do some more meaningful initiative to say, now how do we make this even more seamless for them? How do we make it an easier process for our staff? How do we spend less time doing this process across the board from A to Z? To me, once we start to get really good at this, then we can start to really have powerful data to support or create some new initiatives around it.
Yeah, that's great. That's it for this episode of the RevTech Rx Podcast. I'm your host, David Kozlowski. Thanks so much for watching.